truck moved slow down Buckhorn Road that morning, slow enough that everyone who saw it pass followed it with their eyes, the particular attention small towns reserve for something familiar, carrying something they can't quite place. It was an old red Ford, 16 years on the road, the same age as the boy behind the wheel. 6 layers of wooden fruit crates rode in the bed, lashed down with orange twine, gone the color of old rope from years in the sun, the wood beneath it stained dark with apple juice and orchard dirt that had never fully washed out no matter how many seasons of rain tried. Everyone in Millbrook Hollow, Virginia, knew that truck. It belonged to the Corrigan place, out past the county line where the land started its long climb toward the ridge, where the hollows held morning fog longer than anywhere else in the valley. And the apple trees Silas Corrigan had once tended still bloomed white every April, whether or not anyone picked the fruit. What nobody knew, what nobody could have guessed, watching the truck roll past the feed store and the church, and the little brick post office that had served the town since before most of its current residents were born, was where all those crates were headed, or why a boy who had buried his grandfather barely a year earlier was suddenly hauling other people's cast-off lumber home by the truckload. 3 days later, the same truck came back from Harlow Orchard on Route 9, loaded even heavier, the crates this time gray and split in places, some stamped with the names of farms that hadn't shipped a single apple in a decade. By the end of that first week, close to 200 of them stood stacked behind the Corrigan barn, leaning against each other in a pile that looked, from the road, like something waiting for a burn permit rather than something waiting to matter. The boy stacking them was Nathaniel Corrigan. Everyone in the hollow called him Nate. He was 16, quiet in the way that made most adults assume he was either sullen or thinking, and he had always been the second kind, though it had taken most of Millbrook Hollow years to notice the difference, if they'd noticed it at all. He didn't explain what he was doing, not to the neighbors who slowed their trucks along the fence line to watch him work. Not to the kids at school who had stopped asking by the second week once it became clear he wasn't going to answer no matter how the question was phrased. He simply drove from orchard to orchard, farm to farm, and asked the same 4 words each time he climbed out of the cab. "Can I take these?" Most farmers said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, glad enough to have someone haul away wood they'd otherwise have to burn in a pit or bury under a hedgerow where it wouldn't be in the way of a tractor. But word travels faster than a boy with a truck bed full of crates. And by the second week, Roy Paget, who ran the grain operation next door and had an opinion about most things whether anyone had asked for it or not, leaned over the fence one evening while Loretta Corrigan was hanging wash on the line behind the house. "What's your boy doing with all them old crates, Loretta?" Loretta smiled the smile of a mother who genuinely didn't know the full answer and had decided for now not to worry about it. "Honestly, Roy, I couldn't tell you. Whole town's talking about it." "Whole town's got time on its hands then," Loretta said, and pinned another shirt to the line, and Roy, having gotten neither the answer nor the argument he'd been fishing for, wandered back toward his own fence with his curiosity no better satisfied than before. When someone finally worked up the nerve to ask Nate directly, it was Bo Ashworth, his best friend since the two of them had been young enough to believe the creek behind the Corrigan property ran all the way to the ocean if you followed it far enough, a theory they had spent one entire summer trying to disprove by wading downstream, until Loretta had come looking for them at dusk with a flashlight and a great deal of worry she hadn't bothered to disguise. Bo found Nate behind the barn on a Thursday afternoon, hauling another crate off the truck bed, and asked the question straight out. "You gonna tell me what all this is for?" Nate paused with the crate in his hands, looked at the pile the way a man looks at a locked door he hasn't yet found the key to, and said, still working it out. Millbrook Hollow was the kind of town where a mystery this size didn't stay contained to one fence line for long. By the 3rd week, the crates behind the Corrigan barn had become a fixture of conversation at the feed store counter, and after Sunday service on the church steps, discussed with the particular seriousness small towns reserve for things that don't quite add up. Old Mrs. Petrie, who ran the diner on Main Street, told anyone who'd listened that she'd heard the boy was building a shed to sell firewood out of. Dale Ferris, who worked the counter at the hardware store, insisted it had something to do with a school project, though nobody could recall Nate ever mentioning one. None of the guesses came close, and Nate, hauling another load of crates past the diner window some Tuesday afternoon, never once slowed down to correct any of them. That was the only explanation anyone got that spring. What none of them understood, not Bo, not Roy Paget, not even Loretta, who watched her son disappear behind that barn every evening with something between pride and worry sitting in her chest, was that Nate had been carrying the shape of this idea for months before the first crate ever came off the first truck, turning it over quietly through the tail end of a hard winter until it had grown too large to keep entirely to himself. It had started in February on a night that would have passed like any other if not for what he found, while looking for something else entirely. The tool shed behind the barn hadn't been touched much since his grandfather died, not out of any deliberate avoidance, just the ordinary way grief lets certain rooms go quiet because nobody has quite worked up the heart to disturb them yet. Silas Corrigan had spent 40 years of his life in that shed and the fields around it, had built half the fence posts on the property with his own hands, had taught Nate to drive a tractor before Nate was tall enough to see clearly over the dash without a cushion under him, and had died the previous winter in his sleep, quietly, the way some men manage to die when they've spent a long life making peace with most of what troubled. Nate had gone into the shed that February evening looking for a particular wrench his father had once kept on the third shelf. Instead, his hand had closed around a coffee can wedged behind a stack of old paint tins. And behind that can pressed flat against the wall, in a spot that had clearly been chosen on purpose rather than stumbled into, sat a notebook. The cover was worn soft at the corners in that particular way objects wear when a hand returns to them again and again across years rather than months. Nate opened it under the bare bulb hanging from the shed's rafters. And the first thing that caught his eye was his grandfather's handwriting, slanted hard to the right the way it always leaned whenever Silas wrote in a hurry, which, according to family legend, had been the only speed the man ever wrote at. Sketches filled the early pages, wooden crates drawn in stacks 5 and 6 levels high, arrows pointing toward joints, measurements scrawled in tight columns down the margins. Notes about soil weight, notes about drainage, a phrase underlined twice near the top of one page, stack it up, not out, save the ground. Pages of careful figuring followed, how many crates a given structure might need, what spacing between plantings would let a man reach every level without a ladder, what load a column might bear once the wood had taken on rain and the soil inside it had gone heavy with water. And then abruptly, on a page dated some 14 years earlier, the notes simply stopped. A sentence trailed off mid-thought, the pencil pressure fading toward the end of the line as though the hand writing it had lost conviction partway through the words. The trouble is going to be the wood itself because nothing followed. Nate flipped forward through a dozen blank pages, half expecting the rest of the plan to be hiding somewhere further along, but there was nothing. Whatever his grandfather had been building toward, in the quiet hours before the rest of the house woke, he had stopped short of finishing it, and had never once in all the years Nate had known him mentioned that he'd tried. Nate sat on an overturned bucket in that cold shed for the better part of an hour, reading the same unfinished sentence over and over, feeling something settle into his chest he didn't yet have words for. Silas Corrigan had been, by every account Nate had ever heard from anyone in the family or the town, a man who talked plenty about the things he'd built and almost nothing about the things he hadn't. A fence that still stood 20 years on, a barn roof he'd reframed himself after a windstorm took half of it in one night. An irrigation ditch that had saved 3 acres during a drought bad enough that neighboring farms had lost half their yield. Silas talked about all of it freely, often, with the particular satisfaction of a man recounting problems he'd already solved. He had never once mentioned this, whatever this had been. Nate could still remember, clear as anything, a summer evening when he was maybe 10 years old, the cicadas loud in the tree line and the last of the daylight going soft and orange over the ridge, sitting on the porch steps while his grandfather split kindling with the same easy rhythm he brought to everything he did with his hands. Silas had told him that evening that a farm wasn't really a piece of ground at all. It's a list of problems a man agrees to keep solving for as long as he's able, he'd said, setting another length of wood on the block. The day you quit solving them is the day the land quits being yours in any way that matters, deed or no deed. Nate had been too young that summer to understand the weight behind the words, but he understood them differently now, sitting alone in a cold shed with proof in his hands that his grandfather had, at least once, walked away from a problem instead of solving it. It didn't fit the man Nate remembered. It didn't fit the man anyone in Millbrook Hollow remembered. And that mismatch, more than anything else in the notebook's pages, was what kept Nate turning it over in his hands long after the shed had gone fully dark around him. It took Nate 3 more weeks to work up the nerve to ask anyone about it, and when he finally did, it wasn't his mother he went to. It was Walter Higbee. Walter lived 4 miles down the county road in a house that had belonged to his family since before anyone in Millbrook Hollow could say with certainty which generation had first built it. He was 78 that spring, a retired orchard farmer who had spent 40 years growing apples along the Shenandoah foothills before his knees had finally told him, in the plain, unarguable language knees used, that it was time to stop. He had been, for as far back as Nate's memory reached, the one adult in the hollow who actually listened when a kid spoke, rather than simply waiting out the silence for his own turn to talk. Nate found him on the porch on a Saturday afternoon in early March, sitting in the same wicker chair he'd occupied every afternoon Nate could remember, a cup of coffee gone lukewarm on the railing beside him. Nate brought the notebook, though he hadn't planned to show it to anyone quite yet. And something about Walter's stillness, the way the old man simply waited, without asking a single question, as if he already understood that some things needed to arrive on their own time, drew it out of Nate's jacket pocket and onto the porch railing between them before either of them had said much of anything at all. Walter picked it up slowly, both hands cradling the spine as though it might come apart if he moved too fast. He turned the first few pages in silence, his eyes traveling the sketches, the columns of figures, and then he stopped. And Nate watched something shift across the old man's face, not surprise exactly, closer to recognition arriving late, the way a name sometimes surfaces hours after you've stopped trying to remember it. "Where'd you find this?" "Tool shed, behind some paint cans." Walter nodded slowly, still looking down at the drawings. "Your granddad had an idea one time about growing crops up instead of out. Mentioned it to me once, years back, over coffee much like this one, and then never brought it up again." He turned another page and another and stopped at the blank pages where the notes ended. "Looks like he got about this far and quit." "Why would he quit? Everyone says he finished everything he ever started." Walter was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone careful in a way Nate hadn't heard from him before. "Not everything, Nate. No man gets to your granddad's age without a few things he started and never finished. Some of those, a man just talks about like they never mattered much to begin with. This one he buried behind a stack of paint cans and never brought up again in my hearing. That tells you something about how much it did matter if you think it through." "What happened to it?" "I don't rightly know the whole story," Walter said. And something in the careful way he said it made Nate suspect that wasn't entirely true, though he didn't push, not yet. "What I do know is your granddad had reasons, by the time I knew him well, to steer clear of trying new things where the county might take notice. Man gets burned once trying something like that. He doesn't tend to go looking for that particular fire twice." He handed the notebook back, and Nate held it a moment longer than necessary before tucking it into his jacket again. "You thinking about finishing it?" Walter asked, whatever this was meant to be. Nate looked out past Walter's porch at the long stretch of tired-looking pasture running along the property line, at nothing in particular and everything at once. "I don't know yet. Maybe." "Well," Walter said, settling back into his chair the way a man settles once he's quietly decided something without saying so out loud, "if you do, you come back here first. Don't go off half figuring it on your own the way I suspect your granddad tried to. Some things a man needs a second set of eyes on before he trusts his own math." It was 2 more weeks before Nate went back, and this time he came with a plan taking shape instead of only a question. And it was Walter who first explained where the wood itself was disappearing to. "Wooden crates like your granddad drew are getting scarcer every season," Walter told him, walking the fence line of his own property while Nate matched his unhurried pace. "Plastic bins took over most orchards a decade back or more. Stack better, clean easier, don't put a splinter in a man's palm every 3rd crate he handles. But the old wood, poplar, pine, built thick and solid back when lumber was cheap and labor cheaper, there's nothing plastic that holds up quite the same way once you load it down and stack it high. Trouble is that old wood rots fast left out in weather, and some of it's carried enough pesticide over the decades that you don't want it anywhere near soil that's meant to grow something a person's going to eat." "What if you lined it?" Nate asked. "Sealed the inside so the wood never actually touches whatever soil goes in." Walter stopped walking and studied him for a long moment. A look Nate would come to recognize over the following months as Walter deciding whether the person in front of him had genuinely understood the size of a problem or had simply found a clever-sounding answer to the wrong one. Then he answered it fully. "Then you'd actually have something." He led Nate around the side of his own barn as he said it, to a narrow stretch of ground tucked against the south-facing wall where even in early spring, the grass grew a shade greener than anywhere else on the property. "Feel that," Walter said, and Nate did, noticing for the first time how much warmer the air sat there than it had a few steps back. "Wall holds the day's heat and gives it back slow, come evening. Tree line yonder breaks the wind before it ever gets here. Slope of the land pulls the cold air on downhill instead of letting it pool where you're standing. String all 3 together right, and you can stretch a growing season by weeks on either end without spending a dime on it. Your granddad understood all this. It's half of why he built where he built, though I doubt he ever said as much to you directly." Nate filed the lesson away carefully, understanding even then that it would matter more later than it seemed to in that particular moment. Nate went home that night and barely slept. He sat at the kitchen table with his grandfather's notebook open beside a blank one of his own, and he began filling pages the way Silas must have once filled them, sketches, measurements, questions he didn't have answers to yet. By the time Loretta came downstairs for coffee the next morning, He had a rough plan sketched out that would take him the better part of the year to see through, though he had no way of understanding that yet, sitting at that table in the pale early light with a pencil still warm in his hand. The following week, he drove out to the county extension office on his own, a squat brick building he'd passed 100 times without much thought, and spent an afternoon in a back room lined with dusty binders of old agricultural bulletins, most of them decades old, some going back further than his own grandfather's youth. He found a handful of pamphlets on vertical growing methods, thin and poorly illustrated but useful all the same, filled with the kind of dry, careful language that seemed built to survive exactly the sort of scrutiny Nate would one day have to stand up under, though he didn't yet know that either. He copied whole pages of figures into his own notebook by hand, since the office wouldn't let him take the binders home, and drove back to the farm with cramped fingers and the beginnings of a real plan finally starting to take a shape sturdier than anything Silas had managed to leave behind. The gathering itself took most of March, longer than Nate had first guessed it would. He drove to 8 different farms scattered across the county, some of them familiar ground he'd visited with his grandfather as a boy, others places he'd only ever known by name from conversations overheard at the feed store. At Harlow Orchard on Route 9, the owner, a heavyset man named Gene Tolliver, who'd known Silas since they were both young enough to still be chasing each other through the same rows of trees, stood with his arms crossed while Nate loaded the truck bed and asked, not unkindly, whether the boy knew what he was getting himself into. Not entirely, Nate admitted. Your granddad never did either, far as I could tell, Gene said, and he built half of what's still standing on this county's better farms. Take what you need. He waved off Nate's attempt to pay him anything at all for the wood the way most of the farmers did that spring, glad enough to be rid of it, and in a few cases quietly glad to see a Corrigan out working the same roads Silas once had. At a smaller place near the county line, an aging orchard that had shed most of its trees to disease over the past decade, Nate found the stack of crates that would later cause him the most trouble, wedged at the bottom of a pile behind a collapsing outbuilding nobody had used in years. The owner barely remembered they were there and seemed faintly surprised anyone still wanted them. By the first week of April, he'd gathered more than 300 crates from 8 different farms scattered across the county, the red truck logging run after run down roads that had begun to recognize the sound of its engine before it came into view. He spent the next 2 weeks doing little else but sorting, measuring each crate with a carpenter's tape, checking joints for weakness, running a palm along the grain to feel for the faint roughness Walter had taught him to associate with chemical treatment, a texture somewhere between sandpaper and something slicker underneath. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that didn't look like much from the road. And Nate came to understand, somewhere in the middle of that second week, why his grandfather's notebook had spent so many pages on measurements before ever getting to a single sketch of the finished structure. A plan was only as good as the sorting that came before it. Get the sorting wrong, and everything built on top of it would carry the same flaw forward, hidden until the day it wasn't. He mentioned the project, in the vaguest possible terms, to Mr. Holcomb one afternoon after agriculture class, mostly because he needed to borrow a soil pH testing kit from the classroom supply closet and didn't want to explain why without giving something in return. Holcomb, who taught the subject with more genuine enthusiasm than most of his students ever gave him credit for, asked a few careful questions, and didn't push past the point where Nate's answers turned short. You let me know if you ever want a second opinion, Holcomb said, handing over the kit. I've got a whole shelf of extension reports nobody in this school has ever asked to see. Nate thanked him and didn't take him up on it that spring, though he would remember the offer later, when December made it suddenly necessary. The treated ones he set into a separate pile against the far shed wall, marked with chalk so he wouldn't mix them up later, good only for scrap lumber, for building anything that would never touch a growing plant. The structurally weak ones, split at the joints or gone soft with early rot, he broke down for kindling and framing scrap. What remained, after all that sorting, was 187 crates he judged sound enough to build with. It was near the end of that sorting, on a gray, still afternoon in the last week of April, that he found something that stopped him cold. Buried near the bottom of a stack from an orchard 3 farms over, one that had shut its doors years back, if the faded stencil along the crate sides could be trusted, was a batch of a dozen crates that smelled wrong. Not rotten, not the ordinary mustiness of aged wood, chemical, sharp and old, the kind of smell that clings to a thing the way a bad decision clings to a family's name long after the decision itself is forgotten. Nate set them aside that same afternoon, marked them heavier than the rest, and wrote a note in his own book to ask Walter about that particular orchard's history before he came anywhere near using wood from it. He didn't know it yet, but that stack of crates carried a history longer and heavier than he understood, an orchard that hadn't simply closed from hard times. But one that county records, had he thought to check them that spring, would have shown was cited years earlier for exactly the kind of contamination concern he was now holding, unknowing, in his own two hands. He finished sorting in the first days of May, 187 crates deemed usable, sanded down and sealed inside with food-safe linseed oil, lined at the bottom with landscaping fabric so that whatever grew inside would never once make contact with the old wood itself. It had taken 6 steady weeks of work altogether, most of it alone in the evenings after school and farm chores, some of it with Bo Ashworth standing nearby asking questions Nate never fully answered. "These just really fancy planter boxes?" Bo asked one afternoon, squinting at the neat rows that had replaced April's chaotic pile. "Something like that," Nate said, and kept sanding. He hadn't told Bo about the notebook, hadn't told his mother the full shape of what he was building, only that it had something to do with his grandfather's old ideas, and that he needed the crates for it. Loretta had let that be enough for her. The way mothers sometimes let a thing be enough, because pushing harder for the whole truth can feel like trespassing on a grief that isn't entirely theirs to walk through. At school, the questions had mostly quieted by then, though not entirely. A girl in his history class named Patricia Overholt asked him once, in the particular tone of someone who'd clearly discussed the matter at length with her own family over supper, whether it was true he was building some kind of shrine behind the barn for his grandfather. Nate had told her, evenly, that it wasn't a shrine and left it at that, and she'd seemed disappointed not to have gotten a better story out of him. Bo, sitting nearby, had at least had the decency not to laugh until she'd walked off. The name Gerald Pruitt meant something specific to most of the farmers in the county, even to those who'd never had direct dealings with him. He had run the county agricultural safety office for the better part of 3 decades, long enough that 2 full generations of farmers had grown up hearing about him the way children hear about weather patterns. Not as a man exactly, but as a condition to be planned around. He was known to be fair in the narrow sense that he applied the same standard to everyone, regardless of how long their family had farmed the valley, and known to be immovable once he'd formed a judgment, in the sense that few people in Millbrook Hollow could recall him ever reversing a ruling once it had been made. Farmers spoke of him the way they spoke of an early frost, not with anger exactly, just a wary respect for something that arrived on its own schedule and rarely cared much for anyone else's. There was a Tuesday in the second week of May, unremarkable right up until it wasn't, when Gerald Pruitt's county vehicle turned up the Corrigan Drive for the first time. Nate was out behind the barn checking the last of the sealed crates for drying time when he heard the engine, unfamiliar enough that he looked up before he'd fully registered the county seal painted on the door. The man who climbed out was somewhere in his 50s, solid through the shoulders in the way of someone who'd spent decades walking fields and outbuildings rather than sitting behind a desk. And he carried a clipboard held against his forearm the way a soldier might carry a sidearm. Not brandished, exactly, but never far from reach either. "You're the Corrigan boy," the man said. It wasn't a question. Gerald Pruitt, County Agricultural Safety Office. He didn't offer a hand. His eyes moved past Nate to the stacks of crates arranged in neat rows along the barn wall, 187 of them standing at attention like an army waiting for orders it hadn't yet received. "Word's gotten around town about what you've been hauling in all spring. Figured I'd come look before this turned into something bigger than a boy's hobby." "It's not a hobby," Nate said, and regretted almost immediately saying anything at all. Pruitt's eyes came back to him sharper than before. "Then what is it?" Nate didn't answer right away, and in the silence Pruitt walked closer to the nearest stack, crouched, and ran a thumb along the sealed edge of a crate the way a man tests the temperature of something before deciding whether to trust it near his skin. "You planning to grow food in these?" "Yes, sir, on a commercial scale or strictly for your own kitchen table." "I don't know yet. Bigger than the kitchen table, most likely, if it turns out the way I think it will." Pruitt stood slowly, and something in his expression settled into a look Nate would come to know well over the months ahead. Not anger, not quite suspicion, something closer to a tired kind of certainty. The look of a man who had already lived through this particular story before, and knew several of its coming chapters without needing to be told. "Let me tell you something, son, and I'd like you to actually hear it, instead of just waiting for your turn to answer back." Pruitt tapped the clipboard once against his forearm. "Old orchard wood like this carries history, whether anyone bothers to ask it to or not. Pesticide exposure, sometimes reaching back decades, soaks so deep into the grain that no amount of sanding or sealing pulls all of it back out. I have watched backyard projects turn into genuine health hazards because somebody with good intentions and no documentation mistook sealing for testing. Those two things are not the same thing. I sorted every crate myself," Nate said. "The treated ones are set aside. They're not going anywhere near soil." "You sorted them by smell and by eye," Pruitt said, not unkindly, but flatly the tone of a man repeating a fact he'd stated many times before to many different people who all believed, each in turn, that they were the exception to it. That's not the same as a laboratory test. That's not documentation the county can stand behind if some family gets sick from something you've grown. Something rose in Nate's chest that wasn't quite anger, closer to the particular frustration of being disbelieved before he'd had any real chance to prove otherwise. I found a batch a few weeks back, crates that smelled wrong from the first minute I touched them. I set them aside without needing anyone to tell me to. That seemed to catch Pruitt's attention in a way nothing else he'd said had. Which orchard? Stankel, said Harlow, but the crates underneath were older. Different stamp entirely. Farm that shut down years back, best I can figure. Pruitt's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes did, a flicker Nate couldn't yet read, the particular stillness of a man recalling a detail he hadn't expected to need again. He didn't explain it. He simply nodded once, slowly, and made a note on his clipboard. I'll be watching how this develops, Pruitt said. And there was something in the way he said watching that made plain he meant more than casual notice. You keep building whatever this is, that's your right on your own land. But the day this starts producing food that leaves this property, sold, given away, served at some county gathering, whatever shape that takes, the day it looks like a genuine growing operation instead of a boy's project, it falls under my jurisdiction. And I will hold it to a standard, full documentation, every crate's history accounted for, soil tests wherever I ask for them. That's fair, Nate said, because it was. Even standing there in the moment, it didn't entirely feel that way. Pruitt studied him a beat longer, as if weighing whether the boy in front of him had genuinely understood what he'd just agreed to, or had only said the easy thing to bring the visit to a quicker close. 60 days, he said finally. I'll be back in 60 days to see what this has grown into. If it's turned into something that looks like real food production, I expect real documentation waiting on me. If it hasn't, we won't need to have this conversation again. He turned back toward his truck, then paused, glancing once more at the neat rows of sealed crates along the barn wall, 187 of them waiting to become something, none of them present. Not Nate, not Pruitt, not the ghost of the man who'd first sketched the idea and never gotten the chance to finish it, could yet fully picture. Your grandfather's place this was, wasn't it? Yes, sir. Something crossed Pruitt's face then, brief and unreadable, gone before Nate could put a name to it. 60 days, he said again, and climbed into his truck, and drove back down Buckhorn Road in the same direction the red Ford had first carried its crates 3 months before, taking with him a shape of something nobody in Millbrook Hollow yet fully understood. Nate stood alone behind the barn for a long while after the truck disappeared from sight, watching the last of the afternoon light catch the rows of sealed crates. And then he went inside and found his grandfather's notebook, where he'd left it open on the kitchen table. Beneath the last unfinished sentence, in his own handwriting, for the first time he began to write. He wrote about the 60 days. He wrote about the batch of contaminated crates he'd already caught, months before anyone had asked him to. He wrote, near the bottom of the page, a line that felt less like a plan than a promise made to someone who could no longer hear it spoken aloud. I don't know yet what this is going to be, but I mean to find out, and I mean to finish it, whatever it costs. Loretta found him there before she went up to bed, both notebooks spread open under the kitchen light, and for a moment she simply stood in the doorway without saying anything. The way she'd learned to do that whole year, whenever she wasn't certain her presence would help or only interrupt. Eventually, curiosity won out over caution, and she came and sat across from him, turning her father-in-law's notebook toward herself with careful hands. I never knew he kept anything like this, she said, running a thumb along the worn cover much the way Walter had. 14 years, and he never once mentioned it. Not to your father, not to me. Walter thinks it mattered more to him because he never talked about it, Nate said. Said the things Granddad talked about were the things he'd already finished. This wasn't one of those. Loretta was quiet a long moment, turning a page slowly, tracing one of the old sketches with a fingertip. Your father used to say his own father wasn't a man who admitted to unfinished things, she said finally. I always figured that was just a nice way of saying he was stubborn. Maybe it was something closer to this instead. She closed the notebook gently and slid it back across the table toward her son. Whatever this turns into, Nate, I want you to know he'd be glad someone finally opened it, whether or not it ever works the way you want it to. That night at the kitchen table, long after his mother had finally gone up to bed, Nate sat with both notebooks open in front of him, his own fresh pages and his grandfather's 14-year-old sketches, and for the first time understood the weight of what he'd taken on without ever quite deciding to. He wasn't only building a growing system out of borrowed lumber and old ideas. He was picking up a sentence someone else had abandoned mid-thought, in the same county, under the watch of the same office. And he had exactly 60 days, though he didn't yet know it would stretch far longer than that, into a season and a winter and a fight he couldn't have imagined standing in that quiet kitchen to prove he could finish what his grandfather never had. The 60 days began that same afternoon, though Nate never marked it on any calendar hanging in the kitchen or tacked to the wall of his room. He simply went back to work the next morning, the way he had every morning since February. Except now there was a clock running somewhere behind everything he did, counting down toward a date he'd fixed firmly in his head without needing to write it down anywhere at all. He broke ground on the first column in the second week of May, 5 crates high, following the sketch his grandfather had left half-finished, and the corrections Walter had penciled into the margins of his own thinking over the past month. The wood went up slow and careful, wired at every joint, tested with the flat of his palm before he trusted his weight to the next level. By the time the sun dropped behind the ridge that first evening, one column stood along the south wall of the barn, and Nate stood back from it with his hands on his hips, looking at the thing his grandfather had only ever managed to get as far as paper. He didn't sleep well that night, not from worry so much as the particular restlessness of a boy who has finally begun something he spent months circling. 6 columns stood by the second week of May, arranged in a gentle curve to chase the pocket of warmth. Walter had pointed out weeks earlier the little sheltered microclimate that gathered against the barn wall in the afternoons, held there by the building itself, the tree line to the west, and the slow fall of the land toward the creek. Bo Ashworth came by most evenings once his own farm chores were finished, leaning against the fence to watch, without fully understanding what he was watching. "You going to tell me what these actually do?" Bo asked one evening, while Nate threaded drip line through a salvaged rain barrel mounted at the top of the curve. "Grow things," Nate said, "up instead of out." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got that won't take an hour to explain properly." Bo accepted it the way he'd accepted most things about Nate that spring, with a shrug and a willingness to keep showing up regardless, hauling lumber scraps and holding boards steady while Nate drove the screws home one at a time. Loretta watched all of it from the kitchen window most evenings, a dish towel forgotten in her hands more often than not, torn between the urge to go out and help and the sense that this particular thing, whatever it turned out to be, belonged entirely to her son and needed to stay that way. She had buried her father-in-law the year before and watched her son go quiet in a different way than grief usually made a boy quiet, not withdrawn, but focused, the way Silas himself used to go quiet when a problem had really taken hold of him. She recognized the resemblance without ever quite saying so out loud, afraid that naming it might somehow spook whatever was growing behind that barn wall before it had the chance to finish growing. "You think he's all right out there?" she asked Walter once, when he stopped by to drop off a bag of concrete mix, watching Nate through the window as he wired another crate into place against the fading light. Walter considered the question seriously before answering the way he considered most things. "I think he's doing exactly what a boy ought to do with a year like the one he's had," he said. "Better that than the alternative, Loretta. A grief like his needs somewhere to go. This is as good a place as any I've seen it go." By the last week of May, all 12 columns stood complete along the curve, and Nate allowed himself something close to relief for the first time since February. He wrote the date in the back pages of his grandfather's notebook beneath his own earlier entries, 12 up, holding so far. He had no way of knowing yet how much weight those last 2 words were quietly carrying. The weather turned in the first days of June. 3 days of steady rain rolled through the valley, softening the ground and swelling the wood the way spring rain always does, except this particular wood had sat dry through most of a year, and it drank the moisture in faster than any of Nate's calculations had accounted for. He noticed the first sign of trouble on a Wednesday afternoon, faint outward bow in the second crate up on the tallest column, the wood pressing gently against its wire the way something held under pressure presses back against whatever contains it. He told himself it was nothing. He kept telling himself that for 2 more days, right up until the moment the thing he'd been refusing to worry about happened anyway. It happened at 4 in the afternoon under a clear sky, with no warning beyond a single sharp crack, like a knuckle popping but louder, and then the whole column gave way at once. The bottom crates bulged and split under the combined weight of 5 levels of soaked soil above them, and the tower didn't so much fall as fold, crumpling sideways into the column beside it, which staggered under the impact and went down in turn. 2 columns collapsed within 4 seconds of each other, and a third, at the far end of the curve, tipped slower, almost thoughtfully, before it too gave up and spilled its contents across 20 feet of open grass. Soil, young strawberry starts, splinters of pale poplar wood, lengths of orange twine gone loose in the wreckage, all of it scattered across the ground in the ruin of 3 weeks of careful work. Nate stood at the edge of it with his hands hanging loose at his sides, unmoving, the stillness of someone standing at the edge of floodwater, trying to work out where the water used to end and where it stood now. Roy Paget happened to be driving past on the county road at that exact moment, on his way back from the feed store, and he slowed his truck just enough to take in the scene before continuing on without a word, which was, for Roy, its own particular form of commentary on the whole affair. Nate didn't go inside right away. He walked the length of the wreckage first, crate by crate, studying the pattern of the failure the way his grandfather's notebook had taught him to study any problem before deciding what it meant. Only after that did he go in and sit at the kitchen table with a pencil in his hand for 11 minutes without writing a single word. That night, alone in his room, Nate lay awake a long time listening to the house settle around him, replaying the sound of the crack over and over, the way the tower had folded rather than simply fallen, as though it had made some final decision of its own before giving up entirely. He thought about his grandfather's unfinished sentence. The trouble is going to be the wood itself, because, and wondered, not for the first time, whether Silas had watched something very like this happen to his own structure 30 years before, standing in some other field with the same sick feeling settling into his own chest. It was the first time the whole undertaking had felt less like an inheritance and was more like a warning, and he didn't much like how that thought sat with him, turning it over until sleep finally caught up with him somewhere past midnight. He drove to Walter's place the next morning with 3 of the worst broken crates in the bed of his truck, to show rather than to describe. Walter moved slow across his own porch steps, a man who'd made his peace with taking his time. But there was nothing slow about the way his eyes moved across the shattered joints, once Nate laid them out for him on the top step. "You calculated the dry weight," Walter said, "not a question. I thought I did. You calculated the weight of the soil the day you filled it. Wood swells when it drinks. And you didn't account for what the crates themselves would weigh once they'd taken on a week of rain, on top of everything already sitting inside them." Walter turned one of the broken pieces over in his hands, running a thumb along the split grain. "Your granddad made this same mistake. Word for word, near enough." Nate went very still. "Silas built something like this?" Walter was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that isn't hesitation so much as a man weighing how much of an old story is actually his to hand over. "Not exactly like this, but close enough that I recognized the shape of the failure clean across 30 years. He set the broken crate down carefully, almost gently, as though it deserved that much respect even in pieces. "Come inside. There's something I ought to have shown you back in March, and didn't, because I wasn't sure it was mine to show." What he brought out from a shoebox kept on the top shelf of a hall closet was a stack of photographs dated 1994. Silas Corrigan, 40 years younger than the man Nate remembered, stood in front of a wooden frame structure not unlike the one now lying in ruin behind the Corrigan barn. In the first photograph he was smiling, one hand braced against a support beam like a man proud of something he'd built with his own 2 hands and meant to keep building for years to come. In the second, dated 3 weeks later, the structure was gone entirely and Silas was not smiling. "Your granddad had an idea back then about growing crops vertical," Walter said. "Different reasons than yours. He was leasing a small plot before he ever owned this farm outright, trying to stretch that little bit of ground further than it much wanted to stretch. He built it in about 6 weeks, held for a season and a half before the joints started failing, one at a time rather than all at once the way yours went. But the ending came out the same regardless." "What happened to it?" Walter's jaw worked for a second before he answered, the muscle along his cheek tightening the way a man's face tightens when he's about to say something he'd rather leave unsaid. "County Agricultural Office got word of it. Said it was an unpermitted growing structure on leased ground. Said it hadn't been inspected. Said it posed a liability if it ever came down near the road, though it stood nowhere close to the road, not that this mattered much to the man doing the inspecting." "Pruitt," Nate said. By that point, it wasn't really a guess. Gerald Pruitt was 25 years old and about 4 months into that job when he came out to your granddad's leased plot, Walter said. Carried a clipboard much like the one he's carrying now, 30 years younger and lighter in every way that matters. But carrying it the same, like it weighed more than the paper on it should. Younger fellow entirely back then. Not unkind, the way I remember it. Just certain, in that particular way, a young man gets certain once he's learned a rule book and hasn't yet learned when the rules ought to bend for the person standing in front of him. He shut the whole thing down. Your granddad appealed the ruling, lost the appeal, and by the time he'd have had grounds to try rebuilding it properly, he'd lost his taste for the fight entirely. He never once mentioned any of this, not to me, not that I ever heard from anybody. Your granddad wasn't a man who talked about the things that beat him, Walter said quietly. He talked plenty about the things he built. Never once in all my years knowing him did he bring up the one he didn't finish. Nate sat with that for a long moment, turning the old photograph slowly in his hands, much as Walter had turned the broken joint a few minutes before. The collapse in his own field suddenly looked less like a mistake entirely his own making, and more like the second half of a sentence someone else had started 30 years before he'd even been born. So when Pruitt gave me 60 days, Nate said slowly, he wasn't only doing his job. I doubt he even remembers your granddad's name, Walter said. It was one shutdown among 100 he's done since. But a man builds his whole way of seeing the world out of the things that went wrong on his watch. And I'd wager good money Gerald Pruitt has spent 30 years making certain nothing like that collapse ever happens again anywhere near his own signature. That's not cruelty, Nate. That's a man who's been right often enough that he's quit checking whether he's right this particular time. Nate drove home that afternoon with the photograph resting in the truck's cup holder and a different kind of resolve settling into his chest than the one he'd left home with that morning. He was no longer only trying to finish what his grandfather had started. He was trying to finish it in a way that Gerald Pruitt, the same man 30 years further into his own certainty, couldn't shut down a second time. That night he opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote out questions instead of answers. What weight does fully saturated poplar actually carry once it's taken on a week of rain? What bracing might have caught the failure before it started rather than after? What lighter growing medium could lower the total load came out of it come harvest? He didn't have the answers yet, but for the first time since February, he understood that his grandfather's notebook wasn't going to hand them to him. Walter gave him the beginning of an answer 3 days later, tapping a pencil against a fresh sketch spread across his own kitchen table, coffee cooling untouched between them. Coconut coir and perlite instead of straight garden soil, Walter said. Holds moisture near as well, weighs a fraction of what wet dirt weighs once it's soaked clean through. He drew 2 quick connecting lines between adjacent towers on the sketch. And you brace horizontal between the columns, not only vertical up each one, ties the whole row together so no single column has to shoulder its own failure alone. He tapped the paper twice for emphasis. A man builds 12 columns standing independent of each other. He's built 12 separate chances to fail. A man builds 12 columns tied together. He's built one structure standing on 12 legs instead. Nate copied the sketch into his own notebook directly beside his grandfather's unfinished pages. And for the first time, the 2 sets of handwriting sat facing each other across the spine. One stopped mid-thought 14 years earlier, the other picking the thought back up as though no time had passed at all. Rebuilding took the rest of June and half of July. Nate salvaged what crates he could from the wreckage. 78 of the original 187 proved too damaged to reuse, leaving 109 still sound enough to work with. He spent the better part of a week just sorting the wreckage itself, separating splintered ruin from the pieces still worth saving. And there was something almost meditative in it, he found, going back over the same kind of careful sorting he'd done back in April. Except this time the wood in front of him carried the specific history of its own failure rather than some stranger's orchard. Bo's father drove out one Saturday with a trailer of scrap lumber his own farm no longer had use for, old fence rail, a stack of pallet wood from a shipment of feed, offcuts from a shed he'd torn down the previous fall. And over 4 straight evenings, Nate turned it into 33 replacement frames in the workshop light of the barn, measuring twice and cutting once the way Walter had drilled into him after the collapse. Following the joinery pattern his grandfather had sketched, but reinforcing every corner joint with steel brackets Walter had insisted on and refused to let him skip. The brackets cost more than Nate had budgeted for, and he covered the difference doing extra chores for Roy Paget that June without either of them mentioning why, a small unspoken truce neither one felt the need to acknowledge out loud. By the time the last frame was finished, his working total stood back at 142 crates, down from the original 187, but sound in every joint this time, tested and trusted rather than merely hoped for. He mixed his first batch of the lighter growing medium on the 4th of July, while the rest of the county set off fireworks over the river valley below. And he remembered thinking, working coir fiber slowly through his fingers in the fading light, that this was exactly the kind of evening his grandfather would have found more satisfying than any fireworks display, a problem correctly solved, alone at dusk, with nobody watching to see it happen. The rebuilt structure went up faster the second time, 10 days instead of 3 weeks, because Nate finally understood what he was building rather than guessing at it as he went. 12 columns again, tied now with horizontal cross members at 3 separate heights, the whole curve of them anchored into the ground with concrete footings. Walter had insisted on over Nate's initial worry about the cost. $60 in ready mix and one long Saturday afternoon spent digging. Cheaper than watching it fall down a second time, Walter said, and that had settled the argument for good. By the first week of August, the structure stood exactly where the old one had stood, curving gently along the barn's south wall to chase the pocket of borrowed warmth that stretched the growing season, by Walter's estimate, 2 to 3 weeks longer on either end than the surrounding open fields would allow. Nate drilled planting holes into the sides of every crate this time, not only the tops, spacing them so plants could grow outward from every face of every column, the way his grandfather's original sketch had shown before it stopped short of finishing the thought. Strawberries went in first, staggered up each tower. Fall raspberry starts followed along the lower two-thirds, where the root systems would have time to establish before the first frost found them. He built the water system last, a shallow catch tray beneath each column, feeding into a network of salvaged drip tape that ran back up to the rain barrels mounted at the top of the curve, gravity doing the work a pump would otherwise have had to do. Water in, water caught, water lifted, water in again, a loop that asked almost nothing of anyone beyond what the sky already provided and what the barrels had already been built to hold. Bo spent most of July out there too, showing up straight after his own chores without needing to be asked, holding boards, steady, hauling bags of core and perlite from the truck bed, learning the rhythm of the work well enough by August that Nate found himself handing over whole sections of the rebuild without a second thought. Neither of them talked much about the collapse directly, though Bo brought it up once, hauling a fresh load of lumber off the trailer. "You scared to try again?" Bo asked, not looking up from boards he was stacking. "Some," Nate admitted. More scared of quitting than of it falling down twice. Bo considered that, the way he considered most things, slowly and without much fuss, and went back to stacking lumber. And that was the end of it, though Nate understood, without either of them saying so, that Bo had needed to ask the question as much as Nate had needed to answer it honestly. Roy Paget drove past again in the second week of August, slower this time, and on this pass he stopped his truck at the edge of the Corrigan Drive and sat there a full minute before pulling away without getting out. Loretta mentioned it to Nate that evening, half amused despite herself as she set supper on the table. He looked like a man trying to work out how to be wrong about something without saying so out loud. "He'll get there," Nate said, and went back to checking the drip pressure at the base of column 9 before the light gave out entirely. The first real harvest came in the second week of September, not the kind of harvest that makes for a dramatic photograph, but steady and solid all the same. Thick clusters of strawberries grew sideways out of crate faces that had never once held a growing plant before that summer, and raspberries were just beginning to color along the lower tiers. Nate picked for 3 straight mornings before he had enough to bother weighing, and when he laid the numbers against the yield per square foot figures Mr. Holcomb, his agriculture teacher at the county high school, had helped him pull from state extension reports, the number that came back made him check his math twice before he let himself believe it. 3.2 times the yield of a flat row planted across the same footprint of ground. Holcomb made Nate walk through the calculation twice at his classroom desk before he'd accept it, comparing Nate's raw harvest weights against the state extension office's own published averages for flat row strawberry and raspberry plantings in similar soil and climate conditions, checking the square footage Nate had actually used against what an equivalent flat planting would have required to produce the same volume. "Numbers this good usually mean somebody's fooling themselves somewhere in the math," Holcomb said, running a finger down the columns a third time. "I don't see where you fooled yourself, though. You want to know why that number matters more than it looks like it should?" Nate said he did. "Because most farmers around here have been told their whole lives that better yields cost more land, more water, more labor. You've just shown them a case where all 3 of those things went down at the same time the yield went up. That's not a trick anybody wants to believe, Nate. That's a trick everybody's going to want proof of." When Nate brought the finished numbers to the classroom the following week for the rest of the students to see, Holcomb made sure to explain it plainly to the whole room. None of it came down to any single trick, only a dozen small advantages stacked one atop another, the same way the crates themselves were stacked. Better use of vertical space where a flat row would have wasted it. Improved airflow that kept fungal disease down, the kind that usually plagues berries grown too close to wet ground. A water system Nate had calculated was cutting his irrigation needs by nearly 60% against what a comparable flat planting would require. A growing season stretched further at both ends by the barn wall's borrowed warmth. He called Walter that Saturday morning the way he realized only after hanging up the phone his grandfather might once have called Walter with news of his own decades earlier. "I want to show you something," Nate said. And Walter drove out within the hour, moving slower these days than he once had but no less eager to see what a season's worth of work had come to. Walter walked the length of the columns in silence, pressing 2 fingers into the soil at the base of several to check moisture, counting the spacing between plants with nothing but his eyes, running a hand along a crossbrace to feel how much give it still held after a full season of weather. He didn't speak for close to 15 minutes, and Nate let him take that time without hurrying him along. "How many crates, all told, still standing?" Walter finally asked. 142 usable, Nate said, down from the original 187, after everything I lost back in June and rebuilt again in July. Walter nodded slowly, still looking at the curve of columns, catching the low afternoon light. You built all this out of what people were fixing to burn in a pile behind their own barns. The crates were already built, Nate said, the words arriving before he'd quite decided to say them, though he couldn't have said for certain whether they'd come from the notebook or from somewhere plainer than that. I just gave them somewhere else to be useful. That evening, Loretta put together a small supper on the back porch to mark the harvest, nothing elaborate, just fried chicken and a bowl of the strawberries themselves, sliced and sugared, alongside cornbread still warm from the oven. Walter came, and Bo's parents, and even Mr. Holcomb drove out once his own evening classes let out, curious to see with his own eyes the system he'd only heard about secondhand through Nate's questions and borrowed pH kits. They sat on mismatched chairs pulled from the kitchen and the porch and the tailgate of Nate's truck. And for a while, nobody talked about Western County code or anything at all beyond how good the strawberries tasted. Sweeters, Loretta swore, than any she'd bought from a grocery store in years. It was, Nate would think later, the last entirely easy evening of that whole year, the last one before December's letter arrived and put a clock back on everything. Winter came early that year, the first hard frost landing in the third week of October, and Nate spent the cold months the way his grandfather's notebook seemed to suggest a man ought to spend them, not resting exactly, but working through the next problem before the ground thawed enough to let him act on it. He knew from what Walter had told him that even properly sealed crates wouldn't hold forever, 3 to 5 growing seasons before the wood weakened past safe use, which meant he needed a rotation plan, a way to retire aging columns and rebuild them without disturbing the ones still producing around them. A living system rather than a monument frozen in place. He drove out to the small cemetery behind the Baptist church one gray afternoon in late November, something he hadn't done much since the funeral, and stood a while at his grandfather's headstone with his hands in his coat pockets, not saying anything out loud, just standing, the way a man sometimes needs to stand near a thing before he can properly move past. He didn't tell anyone he'd gone. He drove home afterward and worked out 3 more pages of rotation math before supper, and something about the 2 things happening on the same afternoon felt to him less like coincidence than like the natural order certain kinds of grief eventually settle into. The rotation plan itself took shape slowly across those cold weeks, worked out crate by crate on graph paper spread across the kitchen table most evenings after supper. Nate settled eventually on retiring no more than 2 columns in any given season, rebuilding each one with fresh wood before its neighbors ever needed the same treatment, so that the structure as a whole would never carry more than a small fraction of untested age at any one time. It was, he realized somewhere in the middle of that planning, the same principle Walter had taught him back in June about tying columns together rather than leaving them standing independent. A failure anywhere in the system ought never to threaten the whole of it, whether that failure came from wet soil or from old wood, finally giving out after its years of service. He copied the finished schedule into his own notebook in careful ink, right alongside the bracing sketches from the summer, and felt, closing the book that night, that he'd finally built something his grandfather's original plan had never quite reached. Not just a structure that could stand, but one that knew ahead of time how it meant to keep standing for years after any one part of it wore out. He was still working through that rotation math on a gray Tuesday in the third week of December when Gerald Pruitt's county vehicle turned up the Corcoran Drive again, close enough to the schedule he'd sit back in May that Nate recognized the engine before he'd even looked up, though the growing season had stretched the actual gap between visits closer to 7 months than 60 days. Pruitt didn't smile when he stepped out of the truck, but he didn't scowl either. He carried a folder this time instead of a clipboard, which Nate would only later come to understand was the difference between an informal warning and something considerably more official. "I'll give you credit," Pruitt said, walking the length of the columns with the same slow, assessing gait Walter had used back in September, though where Walter's eyes had softened as he walked, Pruitt stayed flat and measuring the whole way down the curve. "This is more sophisticated than what I expected to find out here in December." "Thank you," Nate said, careful. "That's not entirely a compliment." Pruitt stopped at the base of column 6 and crouched, running a thumb along the seam where crepe met fabric lining, precisely the seam Nate had spent the longest hours perfecting back in the spring. "Sophisticated means it looks like a genuine food production operation to anybody who comes looking, which means it gets held to the standard of a genuine food production operation. Not a hobby anymore, not a school project. A working system this county has an obligation to make certain isn't putting contaminated produce into somebody's kitchen." He opened the folder and handed Nate a single sheet of paper, county letterhead across the top. a case number stamped in the corner beneath it. 30 days, Pruitt said. You provide documentation showing every crate in this structure has been tested clear of pesticide residue. Or you provide documentation showing which crates carry residue and precisely how they've been isolated from any surface that contacts edible produce. Full soil safety report. Full materials chain of custody, every crate's origin farm accounted for down the line. If you can't produce that inside 30 days, this structure gets classified as an unpermitted contamination risk, and county code requires me to order it dismantled. Nate held the paper without reading it yet, the cold December air suddenly sharper than it had felt a moment before. I sorted the crates myself. The chemically treated ones went into scrap lumber, not anywhere near soil. I believe that you believe that, Pruitt said, standing brushing dirt from his knee. But belief isn't documentation. And I've had exactly one experience in this county with a beautifully engineered structure that failed because the man who built it was certain about things he'd never actually tested. I don't intend to have a second. He was already turning back toward his truck when Nate spoke again, quieter than he'd meant to. You mean my grandfather? Pruitt stopped walking. For just a moment, something moved behind his eyes that hadn't been there a second before. Not quite recognition, not quite guilt, closer to a door swinging open onto a room he hadn't stepped inside in 30 years, and wasn't entirely certain he wanted to walk back into now. I don't know what you're referring to, he said, and the flatness in his voice came out a fraction less convinced than it had a minute earlier. Silas Corrigan, Nate said, 1994. Leased the county line. You were about 4 months into this job. Pruitt's hand stayed on the truck door without opening it. That was a long time ago. Walter Higby's got photographs, Nate said, immediately regretting how much sounded like a threat, though he hadn't meant it as one. He tried again, softer this time. I'm not trying to relitigate something that happened before I was even born. I'm telling you I understand why 30 days feels non-negotiable to you. I just need you to know I'm not him. I'm not guessing my way through any of this the way he was. Pruitt didn't answer right away. He stood with one hand still on the door and looked back at the curve of 12 columns catching the last gray light of the December afternoon, at the raspberry canes gone dormant along the lower tiers, drip tape frozen still in its loops, at all of it built, unbuilt, and rebuilt inside a single calendar year by a boy who hadn't been alive to watch the first version fail. 30 days, he said again, but it came out less like a sentence handed down and more like a fact he was reminding himself of. Get me the documentation, Nate. I'm not looking to be the reason this comes down. I'm looking to make sure it doesn't come down on its own, with somebody's child eating out of it first. He climbed into his truck and drove back down the county road. And Nate stood at the edge of the yard, holding a single sheet of paper that suddenly felt heavier than 142 crates of frozen soil, watching the taillights shrink toward the horizon, understanding for the first time with total clarity that finishing what his grandfather started was going to mean walking straight into the one fight his grandfather had already lost. He went inside that night and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of him, his own handwriting and his grandfather's sitting side by side across facing pages. And beneath the last entry he'd written, he added a single line before closing it for the night. 30 days. This time they would finish it. The 30 days began the way most hard things begin, not with a plan, but with a list. Nate sat at the kitchen table that first December night and wrote out everything Pruitt's letter demanded, word for word, the way his grandfather's notebook had taught him to face a problem by naming every piece of it before trying to solve any single piece at all. Full soil safety testing, full chain of custody for every crate traced back to its farm of origin, documentation proving the treated wood had never once touched growing soil. Somewhere in that list, buried beneath the practical weight of it, sat a truth Nate hadn't let himself say out loud yet, that 30 days wasn't really about crates or soil samples at all. It was about whether a boy could finish something a grown man, his own grandfather, had once tried and failed to finish under nearly identical gray December skies 30 years before. He called Walter first thing the next morning. You'll need more than good intentions this time, Walter said, standing in his own kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear, looking out at frost still silvering his fields. You'll need somebody who understands how county paperwork actually works, not only how growing systems work. That was how Nate ended up, 2 days later, sitting across a classroom table from Mr. Holcomb, his agriculture teacher at the county high school, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who had spent more of his career grading essays about crop rotation than he'd spent actually rotating any crops himself, and who lit up like a struck match the moment Nate laid out what he needed. You want to build a case, Mr. Holcomb said, sliding his reading glasses down his nose to study the folder Nate had brought. Sketches, harvest numbers, the water savings calculations from September. Not just answer Pruitt's questions one at a time. Build an actual case argued from the ground up. There's a real difference between the two. I don't know the difference yet, Nate admitted. I just know I've got 30 days and I mean to use every one of them well. Mr. Holcomb tapped the county codebook sitting on the corner of his desk, thick as a phone directory and about as inviting to open. Then let's start finding out what's actually written down in here, instead of guessing at what Pruitt might be willing to accept on faith. They spent 2 weeks combing through it, in the evenings after Nate's farm chores were done, Holcomb reading sections aloud in the flat, patient voice he reserved for students who needed something explained twice before it settled. Nate taking notes in the same book that still carried his grandfather's unfinished handwriting on its earlier pages. Most of what they found only confirmed how much documentation Pruitt was rightfully owed: testing protocols, residue thresholds, record-keeping requirements that made Nate's careful spring sorting look, in hindsight, closer to guesswork than he liked to admit even to himself. By the 8th night, discouragement had started to creep into the work in a way neither of them said out loud but both plainly felt. Holcomb had found 2 other exemption clauses buried in earlier chapters, both of which looked promising at first read, and both of which turned out on closer study to apply only to structures under a certain square footage, well below what Nate's 12 columns already covered. We might just have to give Pruitt everything he's asked for and hope it's enough, Holcomb admitted one night, closing the code book with something close to resignation. Nate didn't argue the point, though he went home that night and sat up later than usual with both notebooks open in front of him, unwilling yet to accept that the only path forward ran through one man's private judgment behind a desk, the same path that had already failed his grandfather once. But on the 11th night, deep in a section of the code that hadn't been revised in nearly 20 years, Mr. Holcomb went still over the page in front of him. Nate, come look at this. It was a single clause buried in a subsection concerning agricultural research exemptions, language so old and so rarely invoked that even Holcomb, who had taught agriculture in this county for well over a decade, admitted he'd never once seen it actually used in practice. A growing structure classified as an educational or research demonstration project, operating under the documented oversight of a county extension office or an accredited agricultural instructor, could apply for a provisional exemption from standard commercial food safety classification, provided the structure underwent a public review before a county agricultural board, with full technical documentation presented openly rather than submitted privately for approval behind closed doors. It's not a way around the safety requirements, Holcomb said carefully, tapping the page twice. You'd still have to prove everything. Soil safety, wood sourcing, all of it, in just as much detail as Pruitt's letter demands. But it changes the room you're proving it in. Instead of one inspector deciding alone behind a desk, you'd be standing in front of a board in public with the whole community watching. Pruitt would have to make his ruling out loud in the open instead of behind that clipboard of his. Nate read the clause through 3 times before he understood the full shape of what Holcomb was offering him. Not an easier path, in most ways a harder one, standing in front of 40 strangers instead of a single man in a truck. But a path where certainty had to answer to something besides itself. You'd need the extension office to sponsor the demonstration classification, Holcomb said. That part I can help arrange. I've got a relationship with the county office through other student projects over the years. But the review board sets its own calendar, and I won't lie to you, Nate, it usually takes months to get on their schedule at all. I don't have months, Nate said. I've got 18 days left by my count. Holcomb was quiet a moment, then reached for the phone mounted on his classroom wall. Then we'd better find out if they've got anything sooner than usual. What they found after 3 days of phone calls and 1 visit to the extension office in person was a stroke of timing that felt less like plain luck and more like the kind of thing Nate had begun to suspect the world occasionally hands a person who's already done the hard work of deserving it. The county's annual agricultural field day, normally held each spring in April, months away, had, for reasons entirely unrelated to Nate's own troubles, been moved up that particular year to the 2nd week of January in order to avoid a scheduling conflict with the state fairgrounds. It fell just over a week before Pruitt's own deadline. It was, as far as anyone at the extension office could recall, the earliest the field day had ever been held, and the first time a public board review had ever landed close enough to double as one. That's hardly enough time to prepare a proper presentation, the extension office coordinator warned Nate over the phone, not unkindly, simply stating a fact plainly. It's enough time, Nate said, though he wasn't entirely sure yet that it was. He spent the following week barely sleeping. Days were for the farm, checking the dormant columns, making certain nothing in the winter cold had shifted or weakened since Pruitt's December visit, and evenings were for the presentation, working alongside Mr. Holcomb to turn a full year of field notes into something a room of skeptical adults could actually follow without losing the thread. Soil mix ratios, irrigation loop diagrams drawn out fresh on poster board, microclimate mapping showing precisely how the barn wall, the tree line, and the slope of the land work together to stretch the growing season at both ends. Rotation schedules for retiring old crates before the wood weakened past safe use. And beneath all of it, quietly, a section Nate insisted on including, even when Holcomb suggested it might not be strictly necessary, full origin records for every single crate, including the dozen he'd set aside back in April for smelling wrong, with a note explaining exactly how and why they'd been excluded from the start. You don't have to include the ones you rejected, Holcomb said. Nobody's asking you to parade your own mistakes in front of the whole county. They're not mistakes, Nate said. They're proof I was already doing what Pruitt's asking of me now, long before he ever asked it. Bo came by twice that week too, not much help with the actual paperwork but useful all the same. Holding poster boards steady while Nate laid out diagrams, running errands to the hardware store for the display stands Holcomb wanted set up around the yard, quietly proud in a way he didn't say outright but showed plainly enough in how often he found reasons to stay a little longer each evening than his own chores strictly required. Loretta kept the coffee going those 2 weeks longer than she probably should have, refilling Nate's cup and Holcomb's without being asked. And once, catching Nate rubbing his eyes over a page of soil test figures well past midnight, she sat down across from him without a word and simply read the page herself. Slowly, the way a person reads something they don't fully understand but want to understand anyway because it matters to someone they love. Your granddad would have sat up just like this, she said eventually, sliding the page back across the table. Different papers. Same look on his face. Nate didn't have much of an answer for that. But he kept working a while longer than he might have otherwise, glad for the company even if neither of them said much else that night. Walter came by twice as well, not to help with paperwork. He claimed no talent for it and made no effort to pretend otherwise. But simply to sit at the kitchen table while Nate worked, the way an old man sometimes sits beside a fire less because he needs the warmth than because the sitting itself matters more than any words he might add to it. On the second visit, watching Nate cross-reference crate origins against a hand-drawn map of orchards spread across 3 counties, Walter spoke without looking up from his coffee. You know he might not budge, Walter said. Public board or private office don't matter much to a man who's spent 30 years building his whole understanding of the world around one collapse he watched happen with his own eyes 4 feet away. I know, Nate said. You scared of that? Nate set his pencil down and thought it through honestly before answering, the way his grandfather's notebook seemed to have taught him to handle any question that actually mattered. I used to be. Back in the spring before I understood why he was the way he was. Now I think I'm more scared of not trying at all. Of doing exactly what Granddad did, building something good and then letting it get shut down without ever once standing up in a room and making my case out loud in front of people where it counted. Walter nodded slowly, and something in his weathered face shifted into an expression Nate hadn't quite seen from him before. Something close to pride but heavier than that word alone could carry on its own. Your granddad would have liked to hear you say that. I expect he'd have liked to say it himself once and never quite found the nerve to. The night before the field day, Nate ran through the full presentation once more on the back porch, poster boards propped against the railing, with Bo and Loretta as his only audience, both of them bundled against the cold with mugs of hot cider going lukewarm in their hands. Bo interrupted twice to ask questions. Nate suspected he already knew the answers too. Mostly, Nate realized, to give him practice fielding something unexpected rather than reciting from memory. Loretta said little until the end, when Nate finished the last page and stood there a moment, unsure whether he'd covered everything he needed to. Your granddad used to get quiet like that too, right before he had to say something that mattered, she said. Right before, not during. Once he started talking, he never once looked unsure of himself, even on days I happened to know he was. She reached over and squeezed his shoulder once, briefly, and didn't say anything else about it. And Nate found that he slept better that night than he had any right to expect, given what the next morning held. The morning of the field day arrived cold and clear, the kind of hard blue winter sky that makes every shadow look sharper than it has any right to. 43 farmers gathered in the Corrigan backyard by 9 o'clock, folding chairs arranged in careful rows facing the curve of 12 columns standing dormant but intact along the barn's south wall, raspberry canes bare, drip tape frozen, still in its loops. Everything waiting the particular way a held breath waits. Roy Paget arrived early and stood near the front, arms crossed, saying nothing to anyone, though he'd come at all, which was itself a kind of statement Nate chose to notice. Bo Ashworth's whole family came, along with half the students from Mr. Holcomb's agriculture class, notebooks in hand as though this were a field trip rather than a hearing. Holcomb himself stood near the folding chairs reserved for the review board, having driven out an hour early to help set the poster board square against the cold morning wind. And he caught Nate's eye once before the crowd fully settled and gave him a short, steady nod, the kind meant to say there was nothing left to prepare that hadn't already been prepared. Loretta stood near the back, close enough to see her son clearly but far enough to let the moment belong entirely to him, rather than to her own hopes for how it might go. At 9:15, Gerald Pruitt's county vehicle pulled up the drive, and he stepped out in a county coat over a collared shirt, carrying a folder rather than a clipboard, and took a seat in the front row beside two other members of the Agricultural Review Board, a woman named Constance Bear from the Extension Office, and an older man Nate didn't recognize, introduced simply as a retired county commissioner brought in for his decades of agricultural experience across the valley. Nate stood at the edge of the columns with his notebook in hand, both notebooks actually, his own and his grandfather's, bound together now with a rubber band he'd slipped over them that morning before leaving the house, and he began. He walked the board and the gathered farmers through everything, the way he and Holcomb had rehearsed it 3 times the night before. Though no amount of rehearsal had quite prepared him for how different it felt with 43 real faces watching instead of in an empty classroom lit by fluorescent tubes. He explained the airflow design that kept fungal disease down along the crate faces. He explained the drainage system, the shallow catch trays, the gravity-fed loop running water back up through the salvaged barrels. He explained the microclimate the barn wall created, stretching the growing season 2 to 3 weeks longer at either end than the open fields around it. And he showed the yield numbers from September 3.2 times what a flat row produced across the same footprint of ground. Irrigation needs cut by nearly 60% against what a comparable planting would have required. He talked for the better part of an hour without once glancing down at notes, because by that point the numbers weren't something he'd simply memorized for the occasion. They were something he'd lived through, crate by crate, failure by failure, across an entire calendar year that had started with a coffee can behind some paint tins and ended standing in front of nearly the whole farming county he called home. When he opened the floor to questions, 3 farmers near the back raised their hands almost immediately, asking about applying a version of the system on their own land. And Nate answered each one plainly, the tone Walter had taught him a good answer ought to carry, enough detail to be genuinely useful, not so much that it turned into a lecture nobody present had actually asked for. One older woman near the middle rows, a beekeeper from the far side of the county whom Nate didn't recognize, asked whether the borage in the raised beds might work for pollinator plantings generally, not just berries. And Nate found himself sketching a quick answer on the back of one of his poster boards, the crowd leaning in a little closer than they had a few minutes before, the whole gathering shifting by degrees from skepticism into something closer to genuine interest. Then Gerald Pruitt raised his hand, and the yard went quieter than it had been all morning. I want to talk about the wood, Pruitt said, standing, folder open in hand. Specifically, I want to talk about a batch of crates this boy has documented as originating from an orchard that closed under circumstances this county's own records show involved a contamination citation. He turned a page, and Nate realized with a small jolt that Pruitt had done his own research in the 18 days since his December visit, pulling the same county records Nate had only guessed might still exist somewhere in a filing cabinet. I want him to explain to this board why crates from that specific origin were ever brought onto this property at all, given what he must have known, or should have known, about that orchard's history before he ever loaded them onto his truck. It was a hard question, aimed precisely where it would do the most damage if left unanswered. And for a moment Nate felt the old December fear rise up in his chest again, the fear that no amount of documentation would ever be quite enough for a man whose whole understanding of the world had been shaped by one collapse he'd watched happen 30 years before. But he'd prepared for this exact question, because it was the same one he'd already asked himself back in April, standing over a stack of wood that smelled wrong before he'd known anything about its history at all. I didn't know that orchard's full history when I first picked up those crates, Nate said, keeping his voice level. I only knew what my own hands and my own nose told me, that something about that batch was different from everything else in the pile. I set it aside that same day before I ever built a single column, before I ever put a seed into any of this soil. He held up the notebook, his own pages rather than his grandfather's. It's documented right here, dated back to April, months before any of this became something the county needed to review at all. I didn't need Mr. Pruitt's letter to tell me those particular crates were a risk. I already knew it, because I checked them myself, one at a time, with my own hands, the way I was taught to check everything before I ever trust it near something I mean to grow. Pruitt studied him for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not quite softening, but recalculating something behind his eyes. That's a convenient story, he said, though there was noticeably less conviction in it than there had been a moment before. "It isn't a story," Walter Higbee said, rising slowly from his folding chair near the front, and the whole yard turned toward him at once. "I've known this boy's family longer than most people gathered in this yard have been alive, Gerald. I watched him sort those very crates myself back in April before any of this had a name yet worth speaking aloud. He set that batch aside the same week he found it, wrote it down the same day he found it. Ask his mother, ask Bo Ashworth standing right there, ask anybody who happened to be in that yard back then, before there was any reason on earth to lie about any of it." Pruitt's jaw tightened, and for a long moment nobody in the yard moved at all. "I believe you," Pruitt said finally, though it clearly cost him something to say it plainly in front of 43 watching neighbors. "I believe the boy sorted the wood correctly. That was never truly my real question." "Then what is your real question?" Walter asked, and his voice had gone quieter, though it carried further across the yard for the quiet in it. "Because I think we both know this was never really about crates, Gerald. I think it's about a plot of leased land near the county line back in 1994, and a young man about a quarter the age he is now, standing right about where you're standing this morning, holding a clipboard the same way you're holding that folder." The yard went utterly still. Pruitt's face, for the first time all morning, lost its flat, measuring calm entirely, and something older and more tired moved across it instead. "That has nothing to do with any of this," Pruitt said, but his voice had already lost the certainty it carried a moment before. "It has everything to do with this," Walter said, not unkindly, the tone of a man correcting an old friend rather than confronting an adversary across a courtroom. "Silas Corrigan built something very nearly like what his own grandson built here 30 years back. And you shut it down before he ever got the chance to prove to anybody that it was safe. He never appealed past that first ruling. Never tried again after. Spent the rest of his life talking about every single thing he'd built and never once mentioning the one thing he hadn't finished, because it was taken from him before it ever had the chance to become anything at all." Walter's voice didn't rise, but it reached into every corner of that yard all the same. "I'm not asking you to apologize for doing your job 30 years ago, Gerald. I'm asking you to notice that you might be doing that very same job today, driven by the exact same fear, instead of by the facts standing right in front of you this morning." Pruitt stood in silence for what felt, to Nate, like the longest minute of the entire year that had led him to this exact moment. He looked down at the folder in his hands. He looked at the curve of 12 columns standing dormant but intact behind Nate, built once, torn down by a June storm, and built again stronger the second time. He looked finally at Nate himself, 16 years old, holding 2 notebooks bound together with a single rubber band, one finished by a boy over the course of a hard year, one abandoned decades earlier by a man who had never gotten the chance to stand in a yard like this one and defend what he'd built with his own hands. "I shut that project down because it collapsed while I was standing 4 feet away from it," Pruitt said quietly, and the admissions seemed to cost him more than anything he'd said all morning combined. "Nobody was hurt that day. But it could have been. I was 25 years old, and I made a decision that felt at the time like the only responsible one available to me, and I have spent every year since making certain nothing on my watch ever came that close to failing again." He paused, and something in his shoulders came down a fraction. "I didn't know back in May that it was Silas Corrigan's own grandson standing in front of me. I want that understood plainly. I was not punishing this boy for something his grandfather did 3 decades before he was born." "I know," Nate said. "I never once thought that you were. But I think," Pruitt continued, and something in his posture had genuinely shifted now, the rigid certainty loosening by visible degrees, "I think Mr. Higbee is right that I've spent 30 years treating every new version of that collapse as though it were guaranteed to happen all over again, rather than asking whether the person standing in front of me had actually solved the very problem the last person never got the chance to solve." He looked down at the documentation folder Nate had prepared, flipping through it slowly now, instead of scanning it the flat, dismissive way he had back in December, actually reading the soil test results this time, the cross-brace specifications, the rotation schedule laid out for retiring aging crates before they ever became a hazard to anyone. "This is thorough," Pruitt said, and it was the first thing he'd said all morning that sounded like an actual compliment rather than a warning dressed up as one. "More thorough, in fact, than what I originally asked of you. I wanted it to be enough," Nate said. "Not just enough to pass. Enough that nobody standing in this yard would have any real reason left to doubt it, one way or the other." Pruitt closed the folder and turned toward the 2 other board members seated beside him, exchanging a brief, quiet word with each in turn. Constance Beer nodded once. The retired commissioner nodded as well, without hesitation. "This board grants provisional research and demonstration status to the Corrigan vertical growing structure," Pruitt said, his voice carrying the flat formality of official language even as something considerably warmer moved underneath it. Under the continued educational oversight of the County Extension Office and Mr. Holcomb's agricultural program, subject to biannual review and ongoing documentation going forward, he paused, and for a moment the formality slipped away from him entirely. And I'd like to add, for the record, that I would welcome this young man's input when this county eventually gets around to updating its residue testing guidelines for reclaimed agricultural wood generally. It's overdue for revision. He has clearly thought about the problem more carefully than the current code has managed to. A ripple moved through the gathered farmers, something between applause and simple exhaled relief. And Nate felt his own shoulders drop for the first time in 18 days, a weight leaving his chest he hadn't fully realized he was still carrying until it was gone. Roy Paget waited until most of the crowd had drifted off toward the tables of coffee and pastries. Loretta had set up near the porch before he finally walked over, hands in his coat pockets, looking somewhere between embarrassed and determined to get through what he'd come to say. "I owe you an apology," Roy said. "Been driving past this place all year thinking you'd lost your mind, boy, and I never once stopped to actually ask what it was you were building." Nate almost laughed, the tension of the whole morning finally breaking loose in him at once. "You owe me a truckload of your old grain sacks, is what you actually owe me. I could use the burlap for mulch cover come spring." Roy did laugh then, short and genuinely surprised at himself. The first time in longer than anyone gathered in Millbrook Hollow could readily remember hearing him laugh at his own expense rather than someone else's. He lingered a moment after, hands still in his coat pockets, looking out at the columns the way a man looks at something he's finally allowed himself to admire without qualification. "For what it's worth," he added, quieter now, "your granddad would have been proud of this. I knew him a fair bit longer than you got the chance to. He'd have been proud." Gerald Pruitt lingered longest of anyone that morning, standing near the columns after most of the crowd had gone their separate ways, running a hand along one of the horizontal cross braces the way a man tests something he's finally genuinely decided he can trust. "Your grandfather would have built this eventually," Pruitt said, not quite looking at Nate directly. "If he'd had somebody stand up for him the way Walter stood up for you here today. If he'd had 30 more days back then instead of none at all, maybe," Nate said. "Or maybe he needed exactly this much time to pass first. Maybe some things only get finished when the right person's standing in the right yard, with the right people standing behind him." Pruitt considered that for a long moment, looking out past the columns toward the tree line beyond. The same tree line Walter had once pointed out to Nate as part of the barn wall's borrowed warmth. 30 years is a long time to carry one afternoon around with you," he said, more to himself than to Nate. "I don't know that I ever once thought of it as something I was still carrying, until Walter said it plain in front of 43 people this morning." He extended his hand, and Nate shook it. And something in the gesture felt less like the formal end of an inspection, and more like the beginning of something neither of them yet had a proper name for. By spring, word of the Corrigan system had traveled well past the borders of Millbrook Hollow. 3 farms across the county line requested consultations before the last of the frost had even fully broken. And Nate found himself, some weekends, driving out with Walter riding shotgun to walk other farmers through the same bracing and drainage decisions he'd once had to work out alone at his own kitchen table. A school 2 counties over inquired about building a smaller educational version for its own agriculture program, modeled directly on Nate's rotation and bracing designs, and Mr. Holcomb drove the 2 hours out personally to help their staff get started, proud in a way he didn't try especially hard to hide. Holcomb began drafting a formal case study, with Nate's direct help, intended for the State Extension Office's spring newsletter, complete with diagrams Nate redrew clean from his own worn originals, the ink steadier now than it had been that first February night in a cold shed with a coffee can in his hands. Roy Paget, true to whatever quiet resolution he'd come to that January morning, showed up one Saturday in March with a truckload of old grain sacks he no longer had use for, dumping them at the edge of the Corrigan Drive without much ceremony beyond a nod in Nate's direction. And the two of them ended up talking for the better part of an hour about mulch and moisture retention, a conversation that would have seemed impossible to either of them a year before. And Gerald Pruitt, true to his word that January morning, invited Nate to sit in on a county working group tasked with revising residue testing guidelines for reclaimed agricultural wood across the whole region. The first time in his long career, he admitted once over coffee in his own office that a 16-year-old had been asked to advise the very office that had nearly ordered his life's work dismantled the previous winter. Pruitt kept a photograph on his desk after that. Nate learned much later, one Walter had given him from the old shoebox, Silas Corrigan, 40 years younger, standing proud in front of a structure that never got the chance to stand for long. Pruitt never explained to anyone why he kept it there, but he never took it down either. Nate kept both notebooks together after that, his own and his grandfather's, no longer bound by a simple rubber band but copied carefully side by side into a single new notebook he bought for the purpose. The way a story sometimes needs to be told twice before it can finally be considered finished. Once by the man who never got past its ending, and once by the boy who came along just in time to give that ending to him after all. He stood behind the barn on a warm afternoon in April, a full year almost to the day since the red truck had first rolled slow down Buckhorn Road, carrying crates nobody in the hollow had understood, and looked out at the curve of columns thick now with new growth, bees working steadily through the borage he'd planted along the base specifically to draw them in, water moving quietly through its gravity-fed loop the way it had moved for the better part of a year now, without asking anything more of anyone than what the sky had already provided freely. The crates had been headed for a burn pile once, every last one of them, cast off and forgotten behind barns across 3 counties. Instead, they had become something that outlived the wood itself entirely, a working system, a lesson passed down without meaning to be one, a debt finally paid in full to a man who had never gotten the chance to pay it himself while he still had the years left to try. Nate thought sometimes, standing out there in the late afternoon light, about the version of this story that never happened, the one where he never went looking for that particular wrench on that particular shelf, where the coffee can stayed wedged behind the paint tins for another 20 years, where his grandfather's unfinished sentence simply stayed unfinished forever, read by no one, meaning nothing to anyone but the man who'd written it and then quietly buried it. It was a strange thing, he thought, how much of a life could turn on something as small as a misplaced wrench and an idle afternoon spent looking for it. He didn't dwell on it long. There wasn't much use dwelling on the version of things that hadn't happened, not when the version that had happened was standing right there in front of him, 12 columns thick with new growth, bees working the borage, water moving quiet and steady through its loop. The boy who had built it, standing quiet in the gold, low light spreading slow across the same barn wall his grandfather had once stood beside without ever quite finishing what he'd started there, understood at last that certain things simply cannot be rushed into being. They have to be built the way his grandfather had always built everything that ever mattered to him, slowly, carefully, one season at a time, failing when they needed to fail and standing back up again when they were ready, until the day finally arrived when they were strong enough to stand entirely on their own.